Hey YouTube, how's it going? Well, it's December. December is the beekeeping time of year for me anyway, where I catch up on my wooden work. Like what we're gonna do today. I'm just gonna show you where I have ended up on building swarm traps. I've been swarm trapping, since I was the beginning of beekeeping, about 15 years ago. And I can tell you, I've made a lot of swarm traps, and I've learned a few things about features that make them better than others. So this is the style I've settled on these days. And you can kind of see, this uses a method, a construction technique started by a man with the username on one of the bee forums. His last name was Coates. I think his first initial was D, so it's like the D Coates method. And the thing about the D Coates method is the handle and the shelf are part of the construction that do not require a router or a table saw or a rabbet in a thicker piece of wood. Now, this technique is better when you use thinner pieces of wood. If you're using wood that's 3/4 of an inch or thicker, you might as well go back and make a rabbet joint for your shelf here. But I've used, this is some reclaimed wood that I've planed down to about 1/2 inch, and some nice thin 3/8 inch plywood on the edge for the faces. And on the back here, I'm going to show you a little bit about this. This is my technique so that your telescoping cover works. It gives a little bit of distance out here for the handle to go, so the telescoping cover works. The biggest problem I've probably found with my previously built swarm traps over time is that a flat lid screwed on ends up leaking, rotting or leaking, and this is the place where the water gets in, and once they start to get damp, the bees just won't move into them. So I'm just going to show you real quick how I make these, give you some measurements, talk about them a little bit, and follow me along and let me know what you think at the end of this video. Hope you enjoy it. Okay, to start out our discussion, the most important thing about making your own bee equipment, whether it be a deep, a medium, or a swarm trap or nuke box or anything like that, is you've got to get the internal dimensions correctly. And this can be tricky, especially if you're following plans from someone else and you go buy wood that's a different dimension, a little thicker or a little thinner. Everything doesn't work out. But if you think about it from the inside out, it will always work. Our frames are the most standard part of what we do here. The internal dimension is the one thing that everything needs to be built out from. The thickness of your wood, the length of these cuts, the size of the bottom, the size of your lid, everything starts from this frame fitting in here nicely, not too tight and not too loose, with the appropriate bee space. And for a standard frame, whether it be a deep or a medium, the internal dimension lengthwise needs to be 18 3/8. That's to the inside of the wall. Now you can imagine if this was a 1-inch piece of wood, that the internal dimension could be 18 3/8, but then now the sides need to be a little bit longer. That's what I'm talking about. Everything starts from the middle in 18 3/8. And of course, with a box like this, the height is of course up to you. But if you're building a standard nuke box, about 10 1/4 is the height you need. For these swarm traps, I'm making them taller with a little bit of a void in the bottom to give me the 40 liters that Dr. Seeley recommends for a swarm trap. So this is about 17 inches tall, but the most important part is the internal length is 18 3/8. Now, because I use a lot of wood that is of different dimensions, I've made a Google sheet where I actually enter into my spreadsheet the thickness of my end pieces, the thickness of my sides, and the thickness of my bottom wood, just in case they're all a little bit different. And then I tell the formula how tall I want this to be, and it gives me the cuts that I want. This is just a little bit of math that you're doing automatically if you do this a lot. The most important part is build your box from the inside out from 18 3/8. So my sides, here on my spreadsheet are gonna end up being 19 3/8 high by 19 3/8 long by 16 1/4 high with the current dimension I have. But let me get going a little bit more and show you some of the cuts and putting them together. But I just wanted to have a little bit of a discussion on the internal dimensions when you're drawing your diagrams or mapping out your pieces. Build everything out from there. All right, to start off the frame for the bottom of the box, to give it the most strength, there's a couple things I want to mention here. 18 3/8 is the inside of the bottom. Now, there's a couple ways you can assemble these boxes. You can put the ends on top of the bottom and shoot the nail up, and then the bottom end wood is exposed. Or you can put the end piece down and cover up the exposed end grain of the bottom board. Like I said before, rot and preventing dampness inside these is the most important. So I have learned that your end pieces need to cover your bottom board and have your bottom board be inside of your plywood sides and your end pieces. That allows the water to sheen off and fall off in the rain. So all this is the end pieces and of course a good glue up. And I use, when I'm doing my glue ups, staples that are at least twice as long. Screws, of course, are good also, but the important thing is using exterior wood glue, and this is Titebond 3 that I use. Some people use Titebond 2. I've been using Titebond 3 for years. Plenty of glue, because ultimately the glue is going to be the strength of this box, not these staples that we're adding. So just as an example, covering up the end and shooting into the bottom is the most important part, and getting the glue up going with one staple and then square it up from there. Now, if your wood has any sort of bowing to it and you need to clamp it up, this is the time to make these joints strong. And just because I'm making this on video, I get the benefit of showing you guys how that works. These staples kind of hold it in place, but to make this a nice tight joint, clamping this here, squeezing it tight till that glue oozes out is the best thing you can do, and then let this harden. So there is the frame, as you can see, the bottom and the sides of our box. And now, the next step, after this dries up a little bit, is just to take these pieces that I've already pre-measured out, and you see that little shelf right there? That's where our shelf is gonna be. And this plywood will give this wooden frame the structure. And because it's 3/8 inch plywood, it's gonna be much, much lighter than if I use hardwood on the whole thing, but it'll still have the same structural strength. All right, I'll come back and show you how to do that after this glue dries up. Okay, the next step, putting on the sides. So the sides, remember, 18 3/8 is in the middle, need to be 18 3/8 plus 2 times the thickness of your end piece. That's why I'm not giving you all these dimensions, because if you're a little bit different from that, you got to do your own measurements. So when I set this side on here in the edge, it's the length of the bottom plus the 2 end pieces. Now you might have wondered why I didn't square up these ends as I was putting this on here, but because I've cut these side pieces out of this 3/8 inch plywood, that's actually, you can tell it's reclaimed plywood, I'm going to square it up as I tack it on because I know that my plywood is square. So just once again, a little glue up. Make sure every surface is covered as best you can so it oozes out when we squeeze it on there. This is where the structure of the box is coming from. This thin wood, plywood, provides a lot of structure when it's placed on here. And of course, bottom up is the answer here. Now I'm going to square up my ends, and now you can start to see my shelf starting to form. All right, now our sides are on. Quick wipe up of the glue. This clamp is no longer needed. And you can see our box starting to take shape. I like to use a wet rag to kind of keep everything cleaned up as best you can so you don't get any huge drops of glue in here. Now, the next piece is going to go on pretty quick, and it's starting to be obvious what's next. The next are the end caps. The end caps create the handle and the shelf that you can see right there. Now, these end caps are just scrap pieces of wood. I use 2 inches high. But once again, it's the width of the end plus the thickness of your 2 end pieces. So I'm not going to give you the measurements, but that's how I do it. I like to put some wood glue here on my shelf because that shelf is going to end up with a lot of propolis on it over the years. But, so now you can see the shape of our box with our shelf. And as a quick check, 18 3/8 is the right size. Now the width of this is 7.5 inches for a 5 framer. If you're going to make a 6 framer, a little bit wider, measure your distance on that, but 7.5 inches is what I use for the 5 framer. Now, next is how I make the lids. We'll be right back. Okay, to make the lids, once again, I don't like to use measurements at this point because if anything else has changed by just a little bit, it won't fit right. So a custom lid needs to go on top of here, but have a little bit of room to move, right? This wood could swell, a little bit of room. 1/8 of an inch on either side of every side is what I prefer, so that the lid fits nicely and snug, but has a little bit of give for swelling. So instead of taking a measurement, now that I've got my box assembled, I'm gonna go ahead and take this measurement. All right, that's 20 9/16. And then the width, that's 8 6/16, or 3/8. I'm gonna add 1/4 inch, so 1/8 inch on either end to those measurements to create the internal diameter of this frame. All right, so that's what I'm gonna do here. This distance plus 1/4 inch, this distance plus 1/4 inch to give the interior diameter of these frame pieces, and I'm gonna go cut this out of 1.5 inch scrap. Okay, I've cut my frame pieces and I've cut them down to size, but just to show you how I do this again. So the full length piece goes here with 1/8 of an inch on either end, and then the end pieces go long ways. You could do it the other way, you just gotta get your measurements right based on your wood, but when this is glued up, you should have 1/8 of an inch all the way around with an inner radius. Let me show you how I do this glue up. If you guys were really watching, you saw me make that mistake. Okay, so that is glued up and tacked up. Now, I will make a point that it is not perfectly square at the moment, and I will show you why. Because when I put my planks on top of here, this is the time to square it up. And I also do this at the moment in order to cut these planks up. So I've got these just pre-trimmed down, but I'm gonna go ahead and make my final measurements and cut these up. We'll be right back. Okay, last little cut here is done. This is where you square up your frame. All right, first piece on here. Now, this is where you square it up because that piece is on there and it looks like it's pretty square naturally just from my glue up. All right, and there is our lid. Quick wipe up of the excess glue. Now, this lid will need to be painted and covered. The most important part is that, a little bit of room. Yeah, back and forth, back and forth. It's a little bit tight side to side. Should have a full 1/8 inch, but I think my wood's bowing just a little bit. Now, I'm gonna cover this with aluminum after I paint it, and then I will show you the next step. I prefer to put a 1-inch hole in the center of the box versus the ends of the box. And you say, well, why the center? Well, over the years, I found every tree isn't the same for hanging these boxes up. Sometimes the arm needs to be on the left side of the tree, sometimes it needs to be on the right side of the tree. And in order to keep, you know, so that your boxes can face southeast, you need to be able to have boxes that have, you know, the hole in the center. If I put it in this end and I put the arm on this one, then I have to have the certain side of the tree to be facing southeast. If I put it in the center, it doesn't matter which side of the tree I hang it on. And the other point I like to make is I put the hole at the bottom. right so it's flush with the bottom piece of wood. And the reason I put it at the bottom and not a little higher is if water does get in here, it needs a way out. If you put the hole a little bit higher up and you do have a well-built box that's well glued together, you've got a spot where water can collect and just sit in there. So bottom of the box is where I put my holes, and I use 1 inch. Okay, this next step is about building a little bit of room so that the telescoping lid can go on. And here's an example of how I did it. Because this is just 3/8 inch plywood, I don't want to put the weight of an entire hive with a swarm in it and possibly some honey and brood on this 3/8 inch plywood. So what I've done is I've gotten some wood pieces to go all the way to the edge. It goes into the ends, and of course this wood piece goes into the sides, the bottom, and the edge with a little bit of thickness so that my handle will go, and there'll be a little bit of a gap here for my lid to move. So the way I do that is I just take these little pieces of strip of scrap. I do take a 45-degree edge off of here so that water doesn't collect. It will kind of roll off. That's as simple as that. And I just glue these down. Now, because I'm gluing these on painted wood, you might have noticed I did sand it down a little bit so that I have a better adhesion surface for the wood to go on the wood, which is why that's slightly sanded down there. It's all going to get painted again anyway. But this is to basically transfer the load over to the end pieces and to spread the load out across the entire board, which will give it some more strength. So lots of glue and a few staples, and then let the glue do the rest of the work. You could put screws in this part if you wanted. Obviously, carrying the load is something to consider. I am putting the load into the end pieces with mostly glue, outdoor glue, and staples. So I do hang it about 4 inches down, so there's plenty of room with my handle. And of course, the first staple going into the end grain piece, and then we'll add plenty more staples for strength and adhesion. These staples are going into the bottom, not just the plywood. Now, one piece of wood isn't enough because of basically the thickness. This one piece of wood is the exact thickness of that edge. So I need to go one more piece on here, and I've got these little pieces, and I've got them cut up also. All right, that's how that looks before painting, of course. Now, I'll just give you an example of a board going on the end of this. This does not exactly fit yet, but see how I'll put that board in there, and I will screw this into those hardwood pieces, and the telescoping lid can still come off. That's how this will work. Hopefully that makes sense. Next step. All right, YouTube, I'm back on the next morning. So I did some painting of our lids so that the water will be sealed in here. And the next step is to add some aluminum sheathing to the top, just to make the weathering and the water to keep it from rotting the wood. It'll just make it last a lot longer. Everything I've done in the past without putting aluminum on top just wore a lot differently. So with a telescoping cover, I prefer to do aluminum sheathing. Now, the way I do this is you get some flashing here, and obviously the flashing needs to be wider and longer than your piece. You don't want to do folds if you can avoid it, because water will find its way in there. And I add about 1.5 inches fold over on all 4 sides. So I've measured this out. I've got a couple marks here, and I've got a square. And I just use a razor knife to score and basically cut this aluminum on a mat here. And it should work out okay. Let's see how this works. All right. Usually, after you score it, you can just kind of bend it. Now, be careful if you do this. You can cut yourself pretty badly. Gloves might be advised if you haven't done this before. Just acknowledge that the edges are sharp. As you can hear, I'm making a little bit of noise. Okay, there's my piece of cut metal. And I'll just kind of set this on top so you can kind of see how it's gonna go. We do have a little bit of bending to do here, a little bit of stapling. Let me get my staple gun. I'll be right back and show you how I do this. All right, I decided to bring you up on the deck and give you a little bit better perspective of what I'm doing. So, if you remember, I added 1.5 inches on the outside edge of this. I've got a square here, and this end of the square is 1.5 inches wide. So to get the initial bend on this metal, obviously you need to kind of choose which side you want down. I'm gonna go ahead, because I got a little bit of glue on here, I'm gonna go ahead and use this. I'm just gonna lean my square over this end, line it up so I've got about 1.5 inches, and now I'm just gonna give a pre-bend here. This pre-bend is going to be very helpful. I'm going to do the same on the other end. Get my 1.5 inches pre-bent on there. And actually, with one bend, just so you don't end up with an extra, you should probably go ahead and use your box to bend the second one. That way, if it's just a little bit off, you're not going to get it short there. See how? Just go ahead and tighten that up. Get that pre-bend on there. Exactly. All right, and once that is on there, and see that is not perfectly square, which is fine as long as it goes over it, but that's why I didn't want to pre-bend that second end, because if I didn't cut my aluminum perfectly square, I have one other trick I'm going to show you. So this other trick I was going to show you is once you've got your metal on here, kind of like wrestling a monkey, you can go ahead and use a mallet to help make that crease like you want. All right. Now, upside down, you can see it a little bit better how it's going to be centered on there. I use T50 flat staples to nail this down. And of course, getting this on here, now the reason I use these flat staples instead of the perhaps crown staples is because the flat nature of the T50s holds this and doesn't go through the metal as much. Okay, now I can work with this a little bit better. I'm gonna staple up here some more. Now the corners are tricky. The best way I've found to do the corners is to get the middle edges down, and they will find themselves a natural bend, and you can continue it. You don't really want to cut that metal, because if you cut that metal, you're going to create a spot for water to get in. So you'd rather bend it over and fold it. Now, getting this just right and starting in the middle, the further you go along, the easier this is going to get. All right, now that's getting close. All right, so now, see these little folded leaves? They're nice. They can go either way you want, but basically what you want to do, and I've got another tool, let me show you. All right, I went and got another tool. You don't need this to do this job, but this is a crimper, and it makes this metal nice, tight, and flat. And if you see here, if I'm gonna make this joint nice and square, having ability of making that nice and flat, better than your fingers can do, is helpful. So see how I've got that nice and flat? So now all I need to do is bend this dog ear over to one side or the other and staple it. Now remember, the lower your staples are, the lower the holes that go into the wood are. So avoid stapling up high and creating little entry points, because theoretically, once you staple it in there, you've created an entry point for the water. This is not a required tool. You could do this with your fingers, pliers if you were careful. Okay, now it's just time to make sure I've got staples everywhere, about every 3 or 4 inches. And that is how I cover my lids with aluminum. Hopefully that was easy to understand and follow. Let me knock out a few more. Okay, we're getting down to the last few steps here. With a 1-inch hole here on the bottom, as we cut it out earlier, you need to keep pests and squirrels and birds out of here. I prefer to use hardware cloth. This is 1/2 inch, so 2 squares per inch. If you just cut out a square, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that, a square so big, nothing can get in there but bees as far as the use of this house. And then inside the box, you just need to kind of staple it. It's a little bit bigger than I need, so I'm going to take it down one more notch. And then using staples, short staples that won't go through the box, just staple this in here. Let me show you how that looks. All right, these are 3/8 inch staples. I just wanted to double check on that before I nailed it in. Double check it didn't come through, and it didn't. All right. So now you've got bird, squirrel protection in here, and now you can just use a disc to go on top of that, and let me show you what that looks like. Okay, as far as the discs going on here, I 3D print these on my printer. You can buy these metal ones. You could put a piece of wood that just slides over. The bees will come in and out of here the way we have it right now. The disc is only for closing it up when it's time to get the swarm trap after you have the swarm move in. So see, a large disc, that'll work. A little bit larger than it needs to be, and just sliding it down to the ventilated spot when you're catching them. These smaller discs I've printed might be just right for this size. Might even 3D print that to make it just a little bit bigger and put a screw in there to just have it pivot upon. And then the same with the larger discs here. That's how that will work. I'll show you what it looks like when I'm finished. All right, guys, it's time to put the handles on. I make my handles out of pressure-treated deck planks that I usually have as scrap. Nice couple inches wide, it's about 3 inches here. I make them about 25 inches long, and the reason I make them about that long is I can carry them kind of without having them to be too long or too short. It's about the right height, and it's approximation. But I have, over the years, had handles that were too long, and it was kind of awkward to carry it by the handle. Obviously, these have handles, you can carry it like this. It's a little bit harder on your back to hold something like this than it is by your side. So that is how I chose my length. Now, these need to be screwed in because this is structural. That's why we added all this wood here, is to have this to go into. A neat trick I'll just show you. If you don't know how to center something on a box, like a board that you don't know it's an exact length, put this on the edge, measure from this edge to the end, that's 17 inches, and put a mark at half of that. So that's 8.5, right? So there's a mark at 8.5. I've already marked this just ahead of time. And there's a mark at 8.5. Now, all you have to do is bring that edge over to that mark, and you've taken into account however wide this is, if it was a weird number or something like that. So make it flush on the bottom. Obviously, you might want to square it up if you don't think you measured very accurately, so you can square it up to the top here. I've already checked that square too, but I'm just letting you know that this obviously is where it's going to be hanging. Now, I use countersunk screws that won't go all the way through. If they do go all the way through, that is not the end of the world, because we can just go inside and shave them off if we needed to. I've got 2-inch exterior screws here. Double checking my lines in case anything slipped a little bit. Don't want to crack this wood because this is obviously your structural strength. I might even add a 3rd screw just because I have room for it. Slightly different angle down here at the bottom to stay a little bit further away from that edge. And that is how that handle works. And let me throw the lid on. So now you can see why we added that extra little bit on the backside. This lid obviously doesn't go to this box. It was a little tight. But so now you've got your swarm trap with your telescoping lid and your structural arm on the back. That is how I make my swarm traps this year. Telescoping lids, 40 liters of volume, hole on the front side so it can go on either side of a tree, and a nice pressure treated or strong arm, because if this gets a full load of bees, this arm is going to be holding everything on here, and obviously a little bit of room in the back for your telescoping lid. Hopefully you enjoyed this. I made 4 of these this year to replace some old rotten ones. These have improvements that I've just described. Let me know in the comments below what you think about this year's swarm traps.